Boldwood presents Finding Love at Roseford Blooms. Written by Fay Keenan and read by Harriet Hare. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Which part of I never want to see you again do you not understand? Lizzie Warner wished she was speaking on a landline instead of her mobile, just so she could have the satisfaction of slamming down the receiver. Somehow, ending the call with a voice command didn't seem to cut it. She gazed gloomily at the traffic ahead of her, wishing for the 1,000th time that she'd elected to have this meeting on Zoom instead. But she needed to get out of the office and away from Paul and the inevitable conflicts that working with and loving the same person had created. Ever since he'd decided to pull the rug so spectacularly out from under her feet. That was the third call since she'd left, she realised wearily. And there had been plenty of discussions before then, but it was no good. The writing had been on the wall long before Paul had decided that he wanted to not only sign over the business they'd set up together to a larger firm, but also to spend several nights with the gorgeous lawyer whom he'd engaged to negotiate the contract. The marketing firm that had been their dream was effectively over, not to mention their relationship. Although he couldn't proceed with the sale of the business without her say-so, in the end, it had just been easier to agree. After all, they'd both walk away with a lot of money in the bank, and, in theory, they could both start afresh. But that didn't mean it didn't hurt. 7 years of their life together had been spent building the business, forming a client base, and becoming one of the most talked-about marketing businesses in the country. Warner Bassett had been all over social media, with a client list that many larger firms had envied. In tandem with their commercial success, Lizzie and Paul had discussed marriage, but it had always been an in-the-future kind of decision. Now, both marriage and the business were off the table, and despite the boost to her bank balance that selling her half of the partnership would net her, Lizzie had never felt more insecure. As the traffic picked up, Lizzie glanced at the screen of her phone to double-check her route. Her final client, before she signed on the dotted line, was based in Hindhead, a fair drive from the offices in London, and she'd never been completely comfortable with driving the route from memory. The sudden onslaught of a summer rainstorm added to her anxiety. As she scrabbled to switch on the wipers and demist her windscreen, the dust that seemed to habitually cover her car in the summer obscured her vision even further for a long moment, until the road ahead became clear again. She swore when she realised she missed the turning she needed. The ETA on Google Maps already told her that she was going to be 10 minutes late, and now she had to make an unexpected detour. As Google's soothing map voice told her to take the next left, she drew in a deep breath. It didn't really matter, she thought. This was a handover, not a pitch. It was just that the client had been one of their first, and Lizzie had always been the main contact for them. She felt she owed them a final face-to-face meeting. However, as the rain got heavier, she felt herself beginning to regret that decision. Proceeding cautiously down a dark tunnel of trees, Lizzie tried to bring her mind back to the imminent meeting. The stuff with Paul could wait. Everything else could wait. She used to laugh when her sister, Georgina, had told her to live in the moment more. Now, the moment seemed the safest place to be. The past was too painful, and the future too uncertain for her to feel at home in either. At least the heavy tree cover was keeping the rain off. It hadn't rained for weeks, and Lizzie could feel the tyres of her Ford Cougar gripping the slippery surface of a road covered with weeks of dust and oily emissions. The rain was making the surface treacherous, and Lizzie slowed her speed a little, nervously aware that she wasn't a terrific driver at the best of times, and these conditions weren't making her any more confident. She pulled closely into a hedge as a huge Range Rover Sport came hurtling in the opposite direction, so close to her own car that it set off the proximity sensors. Just in time, the Range Rover slowed, narrowly avoiding taking her wing mirror off. "Calm down," she muttered to herself. With a bit of luck, she'd be off this lane soon and back out onto the main road. As she emerged from the tree-lined tunnel, to her relief, the next turn put her on a wider road. Glancing at the clock on her dashboard, she pushed her foot down harder on the accelerator. Hopefully, if she got a move on, she'd only be a few minutes late. The rainstorm had abated, and the sun had re-emerged from the bruised, purple-black clouds above her, bathing the road in a mirror-like sheen. If she'd been in a better mood, she'd have taken in the quaint, chocolate box prettiness of the village she was driving through, its red brick houses and green spaces all beautifully representative of the charming Hampshire landscape. But she was too concerned about making this last appointment on time. As she accelerated on reaching the faster speed limit sign on the outer edge of the village, the phone rang again. Glancing down at it, she reached to block the call, but as she looked back up, she saw a large, roe stag herring across the carriageway not 20 metres ahead. In a blind panic, Lizzie slammed on her brakes, forgetting that the surface of the road was like turkey fat in a roasting tin as a result of the rain. As her back wheels spun out towards the white line, and the front end of the car hurtled towards the chevrons, marking a harsh bend, Lizzie screamed. The car, lacking purchase on the slippery surface, turned over and hit the bank at the side of the road, which caused the airbags to detonate. The last thing she saw before she blacked out was the stag, jumping over the green bank that eventually stopped the progress of her spinning car. Chapter 2. When she regained consciousness, the first thing Lizzie noticed was that her phone was ringing, and that the world was the wrong way up. "I must stop that phone," she thought irrationally. But as she reached out to silence it, an excruciating pain in her left clavicle stopped her. As she yelled out in response, Lizzie's breathing started to get shallower, and she felt the panic rising. What if she was stuck here for hours? What if she already had been and just didn't know it? What if the car was going to explode with her in it? All of the most terrible scenarios from the worst car crashes in the direst films and TV shows she'd ever seen vied for dominance in her confused mind until she was shaking all over, not just from pain, but from sheer, blind fear. Lizzie could hear her engine ticking over still and forced her mind to slow down. Even if she couldn't get out, surely she could switch the ignition off. That would minimize the risk of a fire. Reaching out her right hand, which thankfully didn't cause any additional pain, she burrowed under the hanging remnants of the deployed airbag and found the ignition key, remembering, eventually, that, because she was inverted, she'd better not drop the keys. With a shudder, the engine cut out, and Lizzie breathed a trembling sigh of relief. One less thing to worry about. She was starting to get a headache from hanging upside down in the car, and her left shoulder was throbbing. Raising a hand to her face, she could also feel the beginnings of a nasty bruise on her cheekbone, presumably from the force of the airbag. Then, the phone cut into her consciousness again. "Just fuck off!" she screamed at it, the tears starting to drip, irritatingly, into her hair. "Can you hear me, love?" A voice came from a passenger side of the car. "Are you awake in there?" Lizzie's head shot to the left, and through the glass on the passenger side of the car, she could see a concerned face peering in at her. "I'm awake," she said quickly, relieved beyond measure to see another human being. "I've called 999 and they're sending someone out. Shouldn't be too long." As Lizzie focused on the face, she could see that it was of a kindly-looking, white-haired older man, old enough to be her grandfather. She thought she could hear the creak of his knees as he adjusted his position She could see him better from where she was hanging in the upside-down car. "Thank you," she stammered. "I saw a deer and just panicked." "They're responsible for a lot of accidents on this bend," the old man replied. "A law unto themselves they are." His voice was steady, reassuring, and Lizzie realised that he must be trying to keep her calm too. "Should I try and get out?" she asked him. The old man furrowed his brow. "Have you been through a check on yourself?" he asked. "What do you mean? Have you checked to see if you've got any obvious injuries?" Lizzie ran through a quick mental head-to-foot check. Having someone there with her, even a stranger, was helping to keep her focused. Her head hurt, and her cheek, and one side of her collarbone was excruciating, but her back felt fairly normal, even though her neck hurt from the impact. "I think I'm okay apart from my collarbone," Lizzie concluded. The old man looked kindly at her. "I used to be the local copper around these parts. I've seen a few of these in my time." Lizzie nodded, then winced, as the movement sent a bolt of pain through her shoulders. The headache was getting worse too, and she hoped the emergency services wouldn't be long. "Can you unclip your seatbelt?" "I think so." "Brace your good arm on the roof so you don't fall when you do," the man said. Doing as she was told, Lizzie carefully undid the belt and felt her body slacken towards the roof of the car as she did so. Biting back a moan of pain, as she changed position, she took several deep breaths. "Now, can you get out of your side of the car?" the man asked. "I don't know." Lizzie's voice trembled. "I don't think there's enough room between the car and the bank to open the door." "All right," he replied. Then he paused as the distant wail of sirens reached them. "I think you're about to get some real help anyway." "Oh, don't go," Lizzie called out as the man began to move away from the window. "I'll just let them know you're awake and what you've told me about your injuries," he replied. His face appeared briefly at the window once more. "Sit tight. Help's nearly here." "Thank you," Lizzie called out faintly. She was still upside down, and stars were filling her vision again. As she closed her eyes, she relaxed in relief as she heard the sirens stop and the crunch of large tyres on asphalt. The next thing Lizzie saw was a pair of green-trousered legs at the upside-down window, shortly followed by another calm face. "Hi," the paramedic peered in. "Let's see if we can get you out of here, shall we?" After confirming the engine was off and a couple of details about her suspected injuries, the paramedics helped Lizzie through the window of the car and then put her carefully on a stretcher to the back of the ambulance. The situation now had a distinct sense of unreality to it, but as she glanced back, the sight of her beloved cougar looking as battered as she was and still on its roof made her burst into tears. "Don't worry, we'll have you sorted out soon," the paramedic, who was travelling in the back of the ambulance, soothed. The rumble of the engine made the ambulance shudder as they set off. Lizzie tried to relax as the ambulance made its way to the Royal Surrey County Hospital. The painkillers she'd been given for her injuries were taking effect, and she was feeling quite woozy anyway. She was grateful to the old man for speaking to her in such a reassuring way and for calling the emergency services. At the memory of his kindness to her, the tears started again. The paramedic reached out and gave her good hand a squeeze. "Is there anyone you'd like us to call?" she said gently. Lizzie shook her head. Not at the moment. After all, she'd told Paul to get lost, and the last people she wanted to see were her parents. They'd only, after their initial shock, settle into the head-shaking routine they'd been employing ever since she and Paul had split. And the company had been sold, and she really couldn't handle that right now. She needed time for everything to sink in. Then she thought about her sister, Georgina. Should she ask the paramedic to call her? But she dismissed that thought too. Georgina hadn't ever been there for her. Why should crashing a car change that? Chapter 3. In the end, Lizzie's face had taken the brunt of the collision with the airbag, and her collarbone would mend over time, but she'd have to keep it immobilized by wearing a sling for a couple of weeks. Under gentle pressure from the hospital to provide some details, she'd given her parents' name as next of kin. And so she was unsurprised when she came to, after a long sleep induced by painkillers, to see her mother hovering, a look of concerned disappointment on her face. "You're awake," Cordelia Warner said. Then, after a pause, "How are you feeling?" Lizzie leaned deeper into the pillows, wishing she could just close her eyes and go back to sleep. "Okay, I suppose?" "Well, the car's a total write-off," Cordelia said briskly. "It's in the hands of the claims investigators now, but they were pretty clear when they'd phoned Paul that it was unsalvageable." The waves of disapprobation seemed to be coming off her mother, and Lizzie could feel them washing over her. Her mother had never been one for pleasantries or unnecessary affection, and even now she was lying in a hospital bed. Lizzie clearly hadn't cut herself any slack in that department. Why you had to arrange that meeting, I don't know. Her phone call would have been just as good. "I wanted to see Emma and Seb one more time," Lizzie muttered. "I felt I owed it to them, that Warner Bassett owed it to them." "They're going to be far better off with the resources the new company has," Cordelia replied. "You don't owe them anything." Lizzie let a sigh escape from her lips. "Well, thanks for hammering it home, Mum. Was there anything else you'd like to have a go at me for, whilst I'm laying here unable to escape?" Cordelia's face softened a fraction, as far as the Botox would allow. "I was going to suggest that you came home with me as soon as you're discharged. Under the circumstances, and with Paul moving out, it might be easier if you had someone to keep an eye on you." Lizzie's heart sank. She hadn't lived with her parents for 15 years, and the last thing she wanted to do was move back in with them now, however temporarily. The thought of being under their roof filled her with a kind of anxious despair. "Thanks for the offer, but I'm sure I'll be fine," Lizzie replied. "I mean, I'll have to learn to cope sometime, won't I?" "And in the meantime?" Cordelia said. And for a moment, Lizzie saw genuine concern in her eyes. It knocked her off balance a bit, especially in her medicated state. "I'll be fine, Mum, honestly," Lizzie said softly. "I live in London, remember? I don't have to drive anywhere if I don't want to." "Thank goodness for that," Cordelia said. "After all, it was driving that got you into this mess in the first place." Lizzie suddenly felt like the 20-year-old who couldn't pass her driving test, even after 6 attempts and hundreds of hours of lessons. That sense of failure still stung, especially because Georgina had, naturally, passed first time. Perfect Georgina, who'd made such a success of everything. Lizzie winced as she gritted her teeth and tried hard to relax again. "Well, I don't think I'll be getting back behind the wheel anytime soon." Lizzie gazed down at the substantial cuff that led to a foam loop around her neck. She couldn't feel the pain now, but she knew it would be a different matter once the painkillers wore off. 6 weeks, the doctor said, Cordelia replied. "But if you're a good girl, they'll let you out of here tomorrow." Lizzie was relieved. She hated being inactive, and the thought of staying in hospital any longer than she had to was filling her with a great deal of anxiety. Although what she intended to do when she escaped the Royal Surrey, she honestly had no idea. The idea of an empty flat, from which Paul had effectively removed any trace of his existence, filled her with a mixture of sadness and anger. In one fell swoop, their decision to split had taken away her career and relationship. And although she'd had months to come to terms with both, in her vulnerable state, the emotional wounds had burst open again. To her mother, she simply replied, "That's great." But inside, she was starting to quake. She didn't want to go back to her parents' place in Surrey, but she didn't want to be alone either. At the moment, though, These seemed to be her only escape routes from the hospital. Her father and mother had always tried to micromanage her life under the guise of guiding her in the right direction, a good school, a good university, and even an influence on where she got her first job. At the time, Lizzie had been grateful, but as she got older, she found their interference more and more restrictive. With the Warner family, there had been one way, their way. If you expressed an interest in doing things differently, you were quietly and studiously ignored. "Well, I'll leave you to rest," Cordelia said after a slight pause. "Text me if you need anything." "I don't have my phone," Lizzie said. As she realised this, her anxiety ratcheted up a notch. "Did anyone tell Emma and Seb what happened? I'd hate them to think that I stood them up. Oh, will you stop worrying about your stupid clients?" For the first time, Cordelia seemed to lose her careful composure, and Lizzie couldn't help feeling surprised. It was so unlike her mother. Paul phoned and told them, "You don't need to worry." At least that was something, Lizzie thought. She barely even registered her mother also saying that her phone was in the bedside locker. The paramedics had collected it, and her laptop bag, from the car when they'd got her out. Cordelia leaned over and kissed Lizzie's forehead. Her lips felt cool, although that could have been just Lizzie's perception. A fleeting thought that, if it had been Georgina in the hospital bed, her mother would have been far more effusive, flitted across Lizzie's mind before she could stop it. It was far too late to open that can of worms again, and pointless. "Can I think about coming back with you?" Lizzie said. "Of course," Cordelia replied rather stiffly. She took Lizzie's uninjured hand. "I know you've had a horrible time lately, darling, but things will get better." Then, seemingly embarrassed that she'd allowed herself a moment of unguarded emotion, she dropped Lizzie's hand again. "Bye, Mum," Lizzie said. "And thanks for being here for me." Cordelia nodded. "See you soon." As she watched her mother leave the small private room, Lizzie turned her head to one side to look out of the window, which had a rather unedifying view across the car park. She couldn't wait to get out of here, but she still didn't know where to go. Leaning over, rather precariously, to retrieve her phone from the locker by her bed, she saw the vase of flowers on top had a card that hadn't been opened. She'd just assumed they were from her parents, but on reflection, they seemed a little too wild an arrangement to be her mother's choice of blooms, being a mix of fragrant freesias, love in the mist, and sweet peas. Risking a fall, she grabbed the card and somehow managed to rip open the small envelope by jamming it under the cuff of her sling. Inside was a small card with an expression of sympathy and a sweet message from the last person she'd expected to hear from. And in that moment, Lizzie wondered if she had a third alternative to her unwelcoming flat or her parents' house. The card simply said, "Sorry about your accident. Would love to see you soon. B." Next to the name was a small, perfectly formed doodle of a bumblebee. And as Lizzie gazed at the card, she felt her spirits lift a fraction, despite the situation she found herself in. Then she remembered exactly why she hadn't seen Bee in such a long time, and her heart sank through the floor once again. Chapter 4. The next morning, after being given the all-clear from the consultant and the medical team, Lizzie prepared to leave the hospital. Her mother had travelled up to Lizzie's flat and gathered up some bits and pieces for her, so at least Lizzie didn't have to leave the Royal Surrey in the clothes she'd come in with. Dressing herself proved to be a bit of a challenge, but thankfully a nurse was on hand to help with the top button of her jeans and to sling the dark blue hoodie around her shoulders. A baggy vest top underneath covered the essentials, but it was the most sensible thing to wear with the collar and cuff sling in the equation. Tying her trainers was going to be an ongoing challenge, though, and Lizzie made a mental note to sort out ballet flats for the next few weeks. The car journey back to her flat was just about bearable, and after her mother had made them both a cup of tea, the inevitable discussion, begun yesterday, continued much to Lizzie's annoyance. "I'll be fine now I'm home, Mum, honestly, and you don't need to stay with me. I know how you hate being away from Dad. I've got everything I need here. But I don't like the idea of you being lonely here all by yourself," Cordelia replied. Lizzie only just stopped herself from snapping back that she'd be just as lonely stuck in her parents' house in the back end of Surrey, far away from everything and everyone she knew. But she knew it wouldn't go down well. Her mother, in her own way, was trying to help, and despite herself, she was grateful. "Just promise me you'll call if you need anything," Cordelia said, as Lizzie saw her to the door of the flat. "I will," Lizzie said, and forced a smile. But even as she received a slightly awkward hug from her departing mother, she knew she wouldn't. She'd kept her parents at arm's length for years now, and a car accident wasn't going to change that. Apart from the obligatory Christmas and Easter visits, and a duty phone call once a week, she limited how often she saw them. One of the few things she could thank Paul for was that he'd never tried to pressure her into seeing them more often. It wasn't as though they were terrible people, but after a lifetime of doing everything that had been expected of her, in her mid-30s, she'd needed some distance. Unlike her sister, Georgina, of course, who even now lived only half a mile from their parents' place, with her husband and 2 children. But that was Georgina, dutiful, compliant. She couldn't compete with that. She knew. She'd tried. As she closed the door to the flat, Lizzie realised for the first time just how empty the place felt without Paul and his stuff there. He'd been slowly moving out for a couple of months and hadn't actually lived there for about the same amount of time, but in her vulnerable state, all of the emotions she'd kept bottled up after their relationship had ended threatened to bubble to the surface. She tried valiantly to feel grateful that, in selling her half of Warner Bassett Marketing Solutions, she had a very healthy bank balance, which would be a decent cushion and give her the time to think carefully about what she wanted to do next. But the shock of the events of the last couple of days suddenly hit her like a thunderbolt. Now she was back home and alone. Staggering to the sofa in the small living room of the flat, she felt the panic rising. She needed to get a grip. She couldn't spend the next few weeks sitting alone in here, with nothing to do except wait for her arm to mend. She had to get out, but where? Suddenly, Bee's message on the card that came with the flowers came back to her. Could that be a possibility? Thinking about the last time she'd been at Bee's house caused a whole raft of new emotions to rise to the surface, feelings that, in her weakened state, she really didn't want to add to the mix. But given the choice between her own flat, upon which the lease would be up in a few months anyway, going to live with her parents, and going to see Bee, even the past felt like a preferable option. Scrabbling around in her bag for the card, Lizzie turned it over and looked at the phone number that had been written on the back of it. Could she impose on Bee, after all these years? Or was that just hope born of desperation? There was only one way to find out. Grabbing her mobile, she dialed the number and waited. She was almost relieved when, eventually, it cut to voicemail. "Aunt Bee, it's Lizzie." Lizzie swallowed hard. The sound of Bee's voice on the automated system had caused a rush in her head, that she hadn't been prepared for. "Thank you so much for the lovely flowers. I was wondering if I might come and see you for a bit, but not to worry if it's inconvenient." She paused again. "Well, hope to speak soon. Bye." Clicking the end call button, Lizzie carefully put the phone down on the seat beside her. The minute she did so, she started second-guessing herself. What was she thinking? Going to see B was not the answer. More likely, it would stir up a whole soup of discord that she didn't have the physical or mental strength to deal with. So why on earth had she been compelled to make the call? Was it just because Lizzie was touched that B, despite not having been in regular contact for a few years, had been thinking of her enough to send those flowers? Or was it that Lizzie needed to force some kind of closure on what had happened to make her stay away from Roseford in the first place? One thing was for certain. She needed to make some decisions one way or the other, and sitting in a flat that very soon wasn't going to be hers anyway wasn't the way to go about it. She was trying to decide what to get delivered for her dinner that night, cooking anything one-handed being out of the question, when her phone rang. Grabbing it, she felt a flutter of pointless hope that it could be Paul, and all of this was just some bad dream. But no. Looking at the name and number, it was immediately clear it wasn't. She couldn't handle Georgina right now. She needed time to think. Her sister, for all of her good intentions, could wait. She declined the call and slumped back on the sofa. What did it matter anyway? Georgina couldn't offer any comfort or answers from where she was. This was something Lizzie had to work out for herself. But before she could muse on this any longer, the phone rang again. This time it was B returning her call. "Lizzie," she exclaimed down the line, "how wonderful to hear from you. How are you? Did you enjoy the flowers?" Lizzie, despite her mood, smiled slightly at the enthusiasm and genuine interest in her aunt's voice. How different things could have been if B had been her mother, she thought. Not for the first time. "I'm okay, Aunt B," she began, but the enormity of that lie suddenly smacked her in the face. She most certainly was not okay on any level. "You've had such a horrible time, my love. What can I do to help?" B's voice was so gentle that Lizzie's tears had no choice but to fall. "Can I come and stay with you?" Lizzie's voice trembled. There was a slight pause on the line before B replied, "Of course. When would you like to come?" "As soon as I can," Lizzie said, "if it's convenient." "I'll make up the spare room downstairs," B said. "Come as soon as you like." "Thank you, Aunt B," Lizzie replied. "Mum's offered to have me while I recover, but say no more," B said, a note of amusement in her voice. "Let me know when you're getting here and I'll get everything ready." After Lizzie had ended the call, she rang the private hire taxi firm that Warner Bassett had always used and told them the details of the journey. That confirmed, she began the slow process of packing her things. Chapter 5. As the taxi wended its weary way towards the village of Roseford, Lizzie's spirits plummeted in parallel with the darkening skies. A night's perspective had given her an altogether different view of the decision she'd made, much as she'd adored Aunt B when she was younger. Roseford was a place she'd hoped never to see again. Despite the fact that it was one of the most picturesque villages in the southwest of England, for Lizzie, the sight of the baked, shortbread-coloured buildings and the vibrant and colourful hanging baskets that adorned every shop front, and the many tourists buzzing about the place like so many nectar-drunk bumblebees, filled her with trepidation, which was completely at odds with the cheerful scenes around her. She knew, by being here, that she was going to end up thinking about things she'd not given herself permission to do for 20 years, and she suddenly began to wonder if she'd made the right decision in coming back here. Too late now, she thought. Lizzie and Georgina had stayed with Bea a few times during their holidays from the boarding school they'd both attended. The distance between the school and Roseford was roughly the same as between school and their family home. So Bea had opened her house to them from time to time, encouraging them to come and visit. Bea had no children of her own and had seemed to enjoy having the girls to stay. Lizzie had enjoyed the time she'd spent in Roseford until one awful weekend had changed all that. She hadn't been back since and was now wondering if she'd really made the right decision to return. But where else could she go? It wasn't as if she had an army of friends who were willing to help her out. Most of her school and university mates were spread across the country now, and since the vast majority of her work friends, from before she and Paul had founded Warner Bassett, had spent the past year working from home, the friendships she had forged with them had assumed a kind of nebulous distance. Most people had decided to move out of London and either into the suburbs or further afield, leaving Lizzie one of the very few people living in the centre of town. But with the lease on the flat running out and the business sold, for the first time since she graduated, Lizzie felt rootless, alone, and not just a little bit afraid. Was coming back to Roseford really the right decision? These thoughts were mercifully cut short as the taxi drove carefully through the centre of the village and then turned a slow, sloping right to ascend one of the side streets. Lizzie remembered with a combination of trepidation and nostalgia that Bea's small cottage was on the eastern side of Roseford, about half a mile from the centre of the village. The gentle incline of the road as it began its ascent out of the village was lined with trees, and as the taxi driver's sat-nav chirped to make a right turn, Lizzie's stomach did a little flip. There was no disputing the beauty of where Bea lived. Lizzie just wished she weren't visiting it under such strange and stressful circumstances. The last time she'd been in Roseford, she'd begun her visit full of hope and excitement, and it had ended with a night of trauma and despair. There was some irony in the fact that she was beginning her stay in the state she left 20 years earlier, she considered grimly. But the prospect of hope and excitement being her endpoint seemed completely out of the question. Lizzie felt the jolt in her body as the taxi came to a stop outside a charming, whitewashed cottage with the most incredible kitchen garden at the front of it. Bea's passion for plants and flowers had driven her entire life, and this was no more so on display than in the garden of her own home. As a child, Lizzie had loved meandering up and down the channels that Bea had created in the gardens, seeking out the highly scented blooms and unusual flowers, but always remembering to ask permission before she picked any. "Can you manage, love?" the taxi driver asked as Lizzie opened the car door. "I'm fine," she said quietly. The driver, clearly realising that Lizzie had not been in the mood for conversation during their long trip from London, had left her to her own devices, only interjecting when they'd pulled over at a service station about an hour ago. Lizzie was grateful. If she'd been in a better mood, she would have worried that she seemed rude. And as she finally exited the car, she gave the driver the best smile she could muster and thanked him for bringing her safely to Roseford. "I'm sorry I've not been a big talker on this trip," she said. "I've had worse," the driver smiled back. "And given the state of your arm, I think I can let you off." He got out of the car himself and strode round to the boot, stretching his legs out in front of him as he walked. In no time at all, he pulled out her suitcase and the holdall she'd packed for her stay. "Would you like me to take this to the door for you?" he said. Lizzie nodded. "Thank you, that would be great." She trailed in his wake, having managed to close the car door by leaning back on it. As she navigated the slightly uneven path to B's crimson-painted wooden front door, she took a deep breath, and the sense of the vibrant array of flowers on either side of the path hit her like the perfume counter of some high-end department store. All of a sudden, she was transported back to her teens, breathing in the air that had been such a contrast to the starchy, disinfected odour of the boarding school that she'd come from to spend the weekend in Roseford. The memory was almost too much. Lizzie stumbled on the path and only just caught herself from falling flat on her face and doing herself more damage. The taxi driver, having dumped her bags on the small, open porch by the front door, hurried to her side. "Are you all right, love?" he said. He didn't touch her, for which Lizzie was grateful, but she did meet his concerned gaze with another smile. "I'm fine," she said. Then, making a conscious decision to pull herself together, as she had on so many other occasions, she raised her head. "Thank you again," she said. "I can take it from here." The driver was clearly about to suggest he waited until whoever owned the cottage opened the door, but there was something in Lizzie's tone that deterred him. Bidding her farewell, he strode back down the path, got into his car, and drove away. Lizzie, left on the doorstep, tried to take another deep, steadying breath. Before she could contemplate her situation any further, though, the cottage door opened, and on the other side stood the kindly, still beautiful, calm and wise Aunt B. Lizzie, who until this point hadn't realised how tightly wound she actually was, took one look at her aunt and burst into tears. Chapter 6. Having been ushered through a small, dark hallway into Aunt B's charming and very cosy living room, Lizzie collapsed onto the brightly coloured, patchwork-patterned sofa that was situated on the far wall. She was shaking so badly that for a moment she couldn't get a grip on the bunch of tissues that B passed her from the box on the coffee table beside the sofa. Suddenly, all of the trauma of the past few weeks had hit her again, and in one fell swoop, she'd become a messy, blubbering blancmange. "I'm so sorry," she shuddered, before blowing her nose loudly and unceremoniously. "I don't know what's come over me." B, who up until this point had remained quiet, just put an arm around her and gave a supportive smile. Lizzie was grateful that B was obviously mindful of the cuff and sling that supported her arm, and the fact that the slow, careful way she'd moved through the hallway had shown B just how achy and tired she really was. "There's nothing to apologise for," B said gently, as Lizzie tried to get a grip. "You've really been through it these past few weeks, haven't you, darling?" The gentleness in B's tone only served to make another ugly sob rise up in Lizzie's throat. It felt simultaneously like a release and a terrible admission. After a few moments, however, Lizzie's internal voice grew too strong just to sit and cry. It had been a long journey from London, and, as B had observed, a long few weeks. But now she was in Roseford. She should try and make the best of it. It was better than being alone in her flat, after all. "Tea?" B asked, once Lizzie had blown her nose again. Lizzie nodded, still not trusting herself to speak. Once B had returned with 2 steaming, flower-patterned mugs of tea, Lizzie felt strong enough to recount the whole sorry story. As she finished, B cocked her head to one side and regarded her niece levelly. "Well," she said, "that is all rather unfortunate. But I'm sure your dear mother and father have already commiserated and come up with at least 15 alternatives for you to consider about how to spend the rest of your life, so you'll forgive me if I don't offer any immediate solutions to your problems." Lizzie suppressed a smile. Bee's full name was Verbena, although Lizzie had always just known her as Bee. The flower she was named after was said to have balm-like properties, and her calm, pragmatic approach to Lizzie's current predicament definitely felt that way too. Her gentian blue eyes regarded Lizzie with sympathy, but belied the determination she'd shown over the years to live her life on her own terms. While Bee and her sister, Lizzie's mother, Cordelia, had shared many things in common as children, the two women had grown apart over the years, as their lives had moved in different directions. The echoes of that in her own sibling relationship with Georgina were not lost on Lizzie. "It's lovely enough that you've given me somewhere to recuperate for the next few weeks," Lizzie said, her voice still bearing the tremors of her recent crying fit. "I know I haven't kept in touch as much as I should have over the years, but I really do appreciate it." "It was the least I could do," Bee replied. She paused for a moment, as if considering her next sentence carefully. "After all, I'm sure the last place you'd really want to be is recuperating at home with your parents. Well-intentioned as they may be, I hardly see that house as an inducement to getting better somehow." Lizzie gave a wry smile. "Believe it or not, Mum did offer, but I wasn't sure if staying there would do me more harm than good." Then, remembering that Bee was Cordelia's sister, she tried to backpedal a little. "I know they mean well, but even so, it just didn't feel like the right thing to do." Bee looked at her shrewdly, then clearly deciding that it was better to change the subject than dwell on what potentially could be painful, or at the very least frustrating family memories, she moved on. "I've made up the guest room for you," Bee said. "I wasn't sure how you'd be navigating the steep stairs to the first floor, but of course, if you'd rather have the bedroom you stayed in when you were a teenager—" "No, thank you. The downstairs room will be lovely," Lizzie interjected hurriedly. She already felt pretty helpless, having to wear the sling, and with a body covered in bruises. She didn't really need to be reminded of the lanky, gangling teenager she used to be when she had stayed here with her sister in the holidays. Back then, she and Georgina had shared a room.